since the first trade war, where Chinese companies have already been braced for this new uncertainty. And it has set off a globalization frenzy among Chinese companies. If you look at the data, in many, many major sectors, the majority of these Chinese companies have either already considered or already implementing going global plans. In fact, most of times they have backfired. Look at the Spanish blockade of Portugal. Portugal kind of built an entire navy force, in fact, thanks to the blockade, and so many other historical episodes where you cut off something and that a goal becomes of a whole of a nation program and they tend to accelerate. We're seeing some of that in China. I mean, for sure, there is a massive reaction to the technological restrictions. If you take semiconductors, China used to comfortably import them as much as they did oil in terms of value. Now all of that demand is given to domestic companies because in the end, it is no longer just US and China in this world. It is really a global economy. I think that for all of these tactics or strategies or restrictions, there are always unintended consequences to consider.
U.S. President Donald Trump has just hit the world with massive tariffs, with China amongst the hardest hit. This should have been a devastating news for China, but some experts think otherwise. Here, we have an expert on Chinese economy, Keyu Jin, explaining why China will not lose anything. Instead, China will profit from this trade war.
I think that the objectives of the U.S. trade war, whether it was to reduce Chinese exports to the US and thereby reduce the bilateral deficit, or to mitigate China's global position in manufacturing. In that sense, that has totally failed. And I think most economists would agree that trade wars really accomplish very little except to hurt the countries involved. But I think going beyond that, there are also unexpected consequences, which is that it's really been a long march since the first trade war, where Chinese companies have already been braced for this new uncertainty. And it has set off a globalization frenzy among Chinese companies. If you look at the data, in many, many major sectors, the majority of these Chinese companies have either already considered or already implementing going global plans. And that would not have taken place as rapidly had there not been the first time trade or tariff war. Moreover, if you look at the data, Chinese exports really seamlessly flowed away from the US to other countries. And that is why currently Chinese exports are back at pre-tariff war levels, Chinese exports as a share of global exports, and have actually even climbed up. Meanwhile, the US share is declining, which means that China is even more integrated in the global economy than in the past. It's not just the US that is the only country with which it can work. It has a huge market in the developing countries. It is selling to Europe, and especially with Trump's incoming presidency, the potential to weaken the ties with the US allies in Europe means that there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity for China to embrace, to strengthen, and to reinforce these relationships and create new ones. That's what the US-China trade war has accomplished. You see, this is a new trading system, a new globalization network. The network is not static, it's dynamic. You shut off one channel, US and China, you reshuffle the other pieces and they will realign. And we are seeing a lot of countries around the world against this background of US-China competition, signing up new trade agreements, building new trade partners, reinforcing regional trade ties, so on and so forth as a reaction. And this is also what China is doing. There's a reshuffling, dynamic optimization, if you will, of these trading networks or financial networks and technology networks, because in the end, it is no longer just US and China in this world. It is really a global economy. I think that for all of these tactics or strategies or restrictions, there are always unintended consequences to consider. And China is not a place where they would voluntarily just submit to these aggressions, but would actually react to it. I'm not sure if we look at historical cases at either sanctions or restrictions or export controls or all kinds of barriers to another country's progress has ever worked. In fact, most of times they have backfired. Look at the Spanish blockade of Portugal. Portugal kind of built an entire navy force, in fact, thanks to the blockade, and so many other historical episodes where you cut off something and that a goal becomes of a whole of a nation program and they tend to accelerate. We're seeing some of that in China. I mean, for sure, there is a massive reaction to the technological restrictions. If you take semiconductors, China used to comfortably import them as much as they did oil in terms of value. Now all of that demand is given to domestic companies, which are seeing more profitability, more capability, more scope to invest in research and development. And it's really just pushing them, we're forcing them to accomplish something that they didn't need to achieve before. Internal drive has never been as high in China, and you have an entire nation going after the cutting edge technology. This is coming from central to bottom, but also bottom up, where the local governments work with private sectors and entrepreneurs. And you're also forcing the private entrepreneurs, which are actually the driving force of innovation, to do more and give them more opportunities. Unlike trade and investment, where there's a lot of scope for, let's say, back and forth, tit for tat negotiations and scope for normalization to a certain extent, it is true that technological developments are going in parallel ways. Now, do I think that overall this is a good thing for US and China? Absolutely not. I mean, the world is much better where technology can be, to a certain extent, shared for the advancement of the entire global economy. But in this context, it is not as easy to just stop a very rapidly developing big nation with lots of engineers and hardworking people with big market access. It's not possible to stall it. In fact, you can spur them to achieve more. There's a great deal of irony here. When I was writing my book, the discussion was still about technology transfers that Chinese companies demand of international companies, and now the table have completely turned around. What's China's response? Well, first of all, the Chinese government's response is first, let the companies decide, right? If it's a mutual beneficial thing, they will go ahead with it. That's up to them. Shouldn't be imposed from the government top down. Look, this is economics, right? This is capitalism. You're trading one thing for another, which is trading technology for market access. I think the Chinese companies understand that very well, and they're not the first to say no to that. Because if you look at the EV sector or the batteries, Chinese companies are heavily investing in Europe. They're setting up factories, joint ventures, shifting some of the production or research centers into Europe, not into the US, by the way, but of course in Europe. And that is good for both the Chinese companies and for Europe. It is not clear what Trump, when he becomes president, would actually do with regard to imposing how much tariffs on China. I think all of that is still very much in the flux. But what I'm certain of is that China is not interested in a trade war. China is not interested in engaging more economic, financial confrontations with the United States for one reason, which is it's not going to be good for China. It's not going to be good for the US either. The majority of China's economic challenges remains within the country. It's internal. It's not external. The focus of China is not on the US. Contrary to the other way around, there's no dangerous obsession with the United States in China, unlike the dangerous obsession with China in Washington, D.C. But moreover, we've heard multiple times in the last couple of months, the premier saying emphatically that China is going to be the world's opportunity, meaning China is going to open up widely, deeply, broadly, and even unilaterally if needed. China is going to impose zero tariffs on the least developing countries. That is a symbolic gesture of a big country trying to be part of a global story, trying to really kind of lift up the other countries in the network as well. Now, some people think it's a bipolar world where US and China dominate, and some other people think it's more multipolar where India plays an important role, of course, Russia, Europe, and the rising emerging markets. Whatever that is, and maybe it is not black and white, for sure, this is a shifting paradigm, both geopolitically, geoeconomically, and economically speaking. China's approach, make as many friends as possible, given the circumstances. And the competition with the US has completely strengthened that desire. And it is interesting how it's taking a very different approach from the US, with President Trump pursuing a more anti-globalist, anti-multilateralist, de-Sinicization global strategy. China is about embracing these opportunities to create more alliances and forge more partners and new trading partners and new economic collaborative possibilities around the world. And it's trying to come up with new paradigms. I do think that there is scope to create this new paradigm among developing countries because the advanced economy is so far and removed from the situation developing countries have not completely served the needs of the developing countries, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank, multilateral institutions, but also these international organizations. This global rules is written by a handful of rich countries, but the global population, global GDP, and where all the growth is coming from is no longer the center, but in the periphery, if you will. That periphery is no longer really the periphery. And so I think China being more sensitive to the needs of developing countries and some of the injustices in the international systems, not having enough voice given to developing countries can play a much more relevant role in that developing sphere. Now, does it do it perfectly? Sure, it wouldn't. It doesn't do it perfectly. It's again a learning curve of how to also pursue strategies that really is a win-win situation for everyone. But I do believe that China is still very much embracing that win-win possibility rather than the zero-sum concept.
Do you agree or disagree with the analysis presented here? Don't forget to express yourself in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video and want more videos of professionals giving their thoughtful insight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for watching.